This is Brian with ScreenFiles.com in review, and what I'm looking at today is 2022's The Killer, directed by Jae-Hoon Choi. Bang Il-gang is charged with keeping an eye on a 17-year-old young woman by his wife, who didn't even know this young person existed prior. What could possibly go wrong? The Killer opens in what you might want to call a very Quentin Tarantino-esque way, though that would not be terribly accurate because it implies originality. And nothing that Quentin Tarantino does is original. Does he do what he does well? Sure. I don't think that's disputable, though it is nothing that you haven't seen done elsewhere before. Bang Il-gang is played by Jang Hyuk, and he is clearly a little exasperated with having to take care of this young person, who, like most young people, are fairly selfish and self-centered. This irritates him, but he does it because his wife made the request of him. What's particularly funny about The Killer, which is not done in a humorous fashion by the way, the movie is played very straight, but his wife keeps calling him asking about the welfare of this young woman. And this is while some serious violence is happening, most of it done by Gang to protect her. Another source of humor in the movie is the way Bang Il-gang relates to people that are close to him. For instance, he has a weapon supplier, and this man is just very funny. Once again, there are no jokes in this movie. It is played straight, but characters tend to be realized well enough, even characters like the weapon supplier, who don't get a lot of screen time, but he is acted in such an individual and well done fashion that he just works. You accept him, and as a result, his interactions with Bang Il-gang sound particularly funny. Though once again, there are no jokes in this movie. It just works that well. This young woman gets caught up in a prostitution ring, not by any real cause of her own. She just kind of stumbles into it. And they try to make her sell her body. And Gang has to go about retrieving her. This aspect of the movie is fairly similar to things like Liam Neeson's Taken films and so on, where he's typically doing this type of thing in relation to his daughter. And in fact, I would argue it's very close to movies starring people like Charles Bronson, particularly the Death Wish films, and Clint Eastwood. Though there is an important difference. Gang doesn't necessarily rely on advertising his abilities. He doesn't say anything to the nature of,
I can tell you I don't have money, but what I do have are a very particular set of skills.
Nor does he overly rely on weapons. He will use them, and does, but his first impulse, if it comes down to it, is to use his hands and a knife, which is particularly adroit at. We come to learn that Bang Il-gang was a hitman, and while the movie doesn't too often go into his past as a hired killer, though we do see that there's a particular event that happened that shapes his relationship with this young person he's dealing with now. It's touching and kind of beautiful in an odd way. What makes Jang Hyuk's acting as Bang Il-gang particularly effective is that he's in 90% of the movie, maybe even slightly more. But his performance is very subtle and understated. He doesn't even shout in the movie, if I recall. He's very temperate and very, dare I say, mellow. And that makes the movie particularly interesting because you begin to understand how this man could be an assassin. He is unflappable. He is not invincible by any stretch. As you see in the movie, he makes some mistakes, but it's important that he never tends to anticipate events. He is like a rock in a stream, and things flow around him. So he responds, something happens, and he responds to whatever happened. He doesn't try to anticipate. There's a very zen nature to this character. He shows no concern about religion or anything of that nature, but the way he fights and how his fighting is an extension of who he is as a person is done really well. And once again, the movie does not explicitly say these things, but just the way he carries himself and the way he responds to things around him turns him to this odd, very subdued force of nature. And it's in stark contrast to movies of its ilk, such as the Keanu Reeves John Wick movies. Bang Il-gang's character is not unsympathetic to the difficulties people have to go through in their lives. He just doesn't particularly care. If it doesn't directly involve him or threaten his interests, it doesn't really register for him. Though God help you if something does register with him, because he has a way of doing things that will bring about the result he wants. And another thing is that Bang Il-gang is not a good guy. He's not a bad guy either, but he's not a good guy. He is an anti-hero in ways you don't often see in movies. He is not above torturing people if it accomplishes his goal. His goal is his North Star. And in this case, it's getting this young woman back. He will torture you to do it in very oftentimes sadistic ways. But once again, it's just a job for him. Not angry, he expresses little in the way of emotion to what he does, in fact. It feels to me that, as I said earlier, the job is the all. And if you get in his way, he will go around you if he can. But if he has to go through you, that's okay too. It literally is no distinction for him. And another thing I appreciate about The Killer is that it's particularly gory at points. Why is that? If you've seen, for example, the John Wick movies, they are virtually bloodless. There are instances, but it's relatively rare, and considering how people are being killed in those movies, there should be lots of blood all over the place. So, The Killer treats its violence in a more realistic fashion, which is to say, if you shoot someone, they bleed. If you shoot someone in the head, there's blood splatter, most of which I think is practical, though I'm pretty sure there's some CGI splatter as well. Though the violence has a balletic nature to it, not as much as the John Wick movies, but there is a very rhythmic aspect to it. And apparently Jang Hyuk is well-versed, judged by what we see in the movies, which, as far as I can tell, isn't a stuntman with martial arts. He just looks great doing it, and there's an effortlessness to him doing it. In other words, he doesn't look like he's trying, which makes it, by my reckoning at least, even more effective. And in fact, there's a scene in this movie which uses gun kata.
The gun katas. Through analysis of thousands of recorded gunfights, the cleric has determined that the geometric distribution of antagonists in any gun battle is a statistically predictable element.
The gun kata treats the gun as a total weapon, each fluid position representing a maximum kill zone, inflicting maximum damage on the maximum number of opponents, while keeping the defender clear of the statistically traditional trajectories of return fire.
I kid you not, from Equilibrium. And in its way, it's just as silly, but it's more dynamic, I think, in The Killer. In fact, there's a scene, and it doesn't last long, so you have to really watch for it, that almost looks like an homage to a Spike Lee movie. You know, if you've seen any Spike Lee movies, he always tends to feature an individual on a dolly. And it's usually shot from, let's say, the midsection upward, and they're just moving forward, while actually not moving at all. There's a scene that plays similarly in The Killer. And there's an aspect of The Killer that I find particularly fascinating, namely that there is no sense of the other in it. By which I mean American society, and in terms its movies, are based around oftentimes the concept of the other, something alien that must be defeated for whatever reason. This notion of the other permeates American society, I think, to its detriment. Because it works entirely on the basis of dehumanizing something. In other words, the other, making them appear lesser than, so you can more easily kill them. This is something that our military is particularly fond of. If you look at Vietnam and virtually any other conflict the United States has been in, they have othered their opponents. They have made them less than human, therefore, once again, easier to kill. That tendency isn't in the killer, that I could see at any rate. And it's really unusual that it's not, because many movies, particularly American ones, it's present. And so when Bang Il-gang goes against the prostitution ring and its backers, and he tries to take it as high as he can, they just appear like people. Since he has no real agenda other than to rid society of these terrible people, but it's not personal for him. He doesn't hate them. He hates what they're doing and its corrupting influence on people and the way that they destroy young people. But he doesn't hate them as humans. That's one reason I think the character is able to go through these events moderately calm and not angry and not freaking out and killing people that have no reason to be killed necessarily. If you are a threat, if you're involved with these activities, the prostitution ring, he will kill you without a second thought, without even blinking an eye. He will shoot you in the head, which he does a lot in this movie, or he will stab you, or he will torture you. But none of it is done in an angry fashion. In fact, if the killer gets an American remake, I would love to see Paul Verhoeven handle it, because he would, I think, increase that contrast and make it very much about the other, as I mentioned, as in fact many of Paul Verhoeven's American films are, particularly Starship Troopers. What makes The Killer so effective is that while it has the violence, stylized and otherwise, of movies like the John Wick series and Equilibrium, it's not afraid to depict these events in a fashion that more mimics reality. Is it real? Probably not, but it's closer to reality. For instance, there's a scene where Bang Il-gang is tracking down some of the people who are connected to the prostitution ring, and he shoots one in the leg. If this were an American film, I think the likelihood is high that that person shot in the leg would go ow and just continue shooting as if nothing ever happened. That's, I suspect, not very realistic. And in this movie, the guy is in agony. He is shot, I think he's shot in the upper part of his calf. And he just falls to the ground. He tries to crawl away. This makes sense to me because I imagine if I'm shot, I'm not going to just wipe a bead of sweat from my forehead. I'm going to scream. I'm going to try to get away from you. I'm not going to be gung-ho on fighting you after that point. Though, when all's said and done, The Killer, subtitled by the way, dubbing bad. Stay away from dub movies, unless they're Hong Kong action movies, and those are awesome. Though The Killer works really well and is one of the more interesting and realism tinged martial arts crime movies you're likely to see. Now, what do you think? This is Brian with ScreenFiles.com and Review. Do you agree, disagree? Let me know down below. And as usual, consider a like or a follow.